Hey everyone, it's me HawkeyeG and I'm here with another video for you. Today's video is a brief guide about understanding how to put together army compositions of your own at a basic level in order to better understand and progress through your own games. I've got some more detailed army building guides out there, but I've also seen a lot of people online looking for help understanding the fundamentals. This makes sense, of course. Before you can understand why a composition would work, you have to understand the parts it's made of. So in this video, I'll be breaking things down into more fundamental and conceptual levels. We see a little bit of it here, but it means that I'll be dividing units into general archetypes in order to give a general understanding of how they are supposed to work, and then talking about how you can combine these different basic unit classes together in order to form effective compositions. Hopefully this is making sense so far. If not, well, we'll just jump right into the video and start doing the breakdown to make sense of it all. The first thing I want to do is break down many of the different unit types into more generic classes of units that I can talk about more easily. This way I can say X type of unit is good against Y type of unit without having to go into the deep details for specific units. The point of doing this is to establish a better foundation with which to understand the purpose of all units, as well as easily describing how they work together. Since this is meant to be a guide on the basics of army composition, I am going to focus a lot more on the simpler units that are available more widely to pretty much every race in the game at a basic level. So to begin, I'll set some traditional classes that we've essentially seen across all Total War games, and we pretty much see them here. These are Infantry, Archers or Missile Infantry, Cavalry, and Artillery. Now you'll notice I haven't talked about Lords and Heroes. I think even that is going to be too complex for the scope of this guide. I've left out Missile Cavalry and Chariots, and I'm not going to talk about things like monstrous infantry, single entities a whole lot. I'm going to just kind of generally refer to those as specialty units, but we're not going to get too deep into that. I just want to focus on infantry, archers, cavalry, artillery. We'll see there's a bit of a rock, paper, scissors nature to these classifications, but we'll talk about that more a little later. So let's look at some example units and create some generalized classes from them, starting with the definition of infantry unit types. So I have the Empire roster brought up here. It works with pretty much any of these rosters, but obviously some of these are going to be name-to-name matches. It's going to make things easier to understand. The first unit type, of course, is a unit familiar to many, the Spearmen. This is a melee infantry unit available for very nearly every race. It's a staple in many composition types. The purpose of this unit is to act as a defensive infantry unit. They also typically serve a somewhat secondary role as anti-large or anti-cavalry unit. In general, any Spearman classified unit would have high melee defense, but low melee attack, and is likely to have a shield as well as some armor. It's also typical to have this bonus versus large damage. How much armor or how good of stats they have can vary in degree, but their purpose is the same in every roster. The next unit type is also a pretty familiar one, I'm sure, the Swordsmen. This is another melee infantry unit, but as opposed to the Spearmen, it's meant more for offensive use rather than defensive. That doesn't mean it can't be well armored or have a shield, but in general, it's likely to have higher melee attack and lower melee defense, especially when compared to the Spearmen with shields. You can see here the Spearmen with shields, much less melee attack, much more melee defense compared to the Swordsmen. Swordsman's a more balanced unit. The Flagellants, perhaps another example where this is what I would also call a swordsman type of unit, where it has high melee attack, low melee defense. In effect, its purpose is to defeat other infantry units, and this includes missile infantry. A good swordsman unit is designed to pierce the defenses of a spearman type unit and will also cause immense problems for archers and artillery if they reach those units. Another unit class to bring up is the archer type. Another one I'm sure everyone is familiar with, but it's important to bring up anyway. It's technically an infantry unit, but because it's a ranged attacker, I'm classifying it as separate. I mean, we can see here there's infantry and missile infantry. I'm just going to refer to them as archers. Generally speaking, they will have less favorable melee attack, melee defense, and armor than whatever melee infantry counterparts their race has. So we can see here, even looking at crossbowmen, their melee attack, defense, and armor do not compare to that of the swordsmen or spearmen with shields. But of course, they have a ranged attack, which those melee units don't. The purpose of this unit is to deal damage. It's pretty universal. They work very well against any large type of units, but if I'm speaking strictly in historical and fundamental terms, they're actually meant for defeating enemy infantry. There's also variations like archers versus handgunners, where their line of sight will be different, their attack pattern is different, and they deal different types of damage like the armor piercing. But for now, I really do want to keep it simple and just refer to both of these two separate types as archers. That means the next class to bring up is the general form of cavalry units, another staple in really any total war game and historic warfare in general. They're going to be high mobility units. You can see their speed stat here compared to spearmen or archers is going to be significantly higher. They also have fewer models in their units. So we have 45 cavalry per unit on large battle size, but 90 spearmen, swordsmen, 68 archers, and crossbowmen. So you can see we have a lot less units to work with. They will have bonuses to their initial attacks. That's what this charge bonus represents. You can see their melee attack and defense is similar to that of a swordsman, but their charge bonus is significantly higher. That's a bonus to their attack and damage when they're on that initial charge into the enemy. But they're often not as good at prolonged combat compared to these other infantry class units. In general, their purpose is to circumvent the enemy's formation and either destroy or at least put pressure on the enemy archers and artillery. That, of course, brings us to our last classification, which is the artillery type. We could kind of classify these as archer units because they serve a similar function, but even so, they're typically even more fragile than archers and slower moving to boot. I mean, you can see their speed is much worse, their melee attack and defense is much worse. It's showing the crossbowmen have an increase to that stat. Their health is worse, and their model count is severely reduced. You get 3 mortars, where you have 68 crossbowmen, so losing a single mortar is actually pretty serious to that unit's ability to deal damage, whereas losing even 10 crossbowmen isn't as serious of a threat. It's basically a further trade-off with archers for better strengths but increased weaknesses, and of course one of the main things to note about artillery is it has a vastly superior range than archers do. There's also different varieties of artillery, similar to missile infantry having arcing shot style archers and an armor piercing bullet style handgunners. We kind of have your mortar and your cannon types. But again, I don't want to get too into the details of that. It's just an important thing to consider whether your artillery of choice is meant to specialize in targeting cavalry or infantry as a general rule. Now these are the basic unit types I want to focus on talking about in this guide. There's a lot of specific things I've left out, however, especially as a result of this game being in the fantasy genre. We have flying units, we have monstrous infantry, large single entities, chariots, missile cavalry, lords, heroes, etc. But that's all getting a bit too complicated for a fundamentals-focused guide on building your own armies. So I'm going to generally refer to anything else as specialty type units as a whole for the purpose of this video, and I won't talk about them at great length here. If you're looking for a way to classify some of them so you know what units to use against them, I would start by just looking at how many models are in the units and compare it to something else. As a quick example, if we glance at the Vampire Counts roster, they've got plenty of these monsters and beasts that I've mentioned. Something like Fellbats has 45, which doesn't seem like a lot of units, but compared to something like their Vargeist, which only has 12 units and is a large entity, so you could make similar comparisons to this being an infantry type unit and this being more of a cavalry type unit. So hopefully that just helps you distinguish between them a little bit for the purposes of target selection. And I won't be focusing too much on it in this particular video, so I don't want you to worry if you might be feeling a little overwhelmed already. So that means, with all the different types of units simplified into basic classes, we're almost ready to talk about how to build your own army. But before I do that, I want to mention a few different factors that we want to make ourselves aware of before putting an army together. You first need to have a good idea of what types of units work well together, which I will talk more about when we're actually building the compositions, but you also need to understand unit matchups and counters so you don't use the wrong unit against an enemy unit. In basic terms, I'd think of this as something like a combat triangle. Archers beat spearmen, spearmen beat cavalry, and cavalry beat archers. Artillery should theoretically beat most things as long as they're left alone, but pretty much anything beats artillery if they actually get within attacking range. So you can see from the results the pretty basic application of having the spearmen attacking the cavalry, archers attacking the spearmen, cavalry attacking their archers. We get a pretty excellent battle result. Now the first unique aspect to consider is what race you're playing as and what they specialize in. Virtually every roster in the game has a spearman type unit, Exceptions are rare, and it's races like Demons of Chaos and the like who have these. Maybe they have a swordsman unit and don't really have a spearman, but the point is that not every race in the game will have a desirable or even effective spearman-oriented composition. As an example, pairing spearmen with archers works really well. But for a race like the Lizardmen, which doesn't have a lot of really outstanding archers to begin with, even though they have some good spearman-type units, it may not be the correct choice when looking to play into your faction's strengths when building your composition. Another factor is going to be the enemy race and what they like to use. I think this is less important to consider, at least when you're looking to understand the fundamentals of army building. And again, in a basics guide, I don't want to get too deep into those details. But many races in the game have a lot of flexible options for how to build their army compositions, so it's usually worth considering the strengths of your enemy, and then if possible, tailoring your army to counteract that. In my opinion, it's what some races who don't have standout units of certain types use in order to overcome some of those shortcomings by having a good variety and using good unit counters. As an example, if you know that your enemy is an archer or artillery heavy race, and especially if they're one with low mobility, then you'd find a lot of value in a cavalry-based composition. The last piece, of course, is to recognize your own limitations on how many things you are capable of managing in a battle, or perhaps simply how much you're willing to manage. Bringing 3 artillery, and 3 cavalry, and 4 flyers, and 4 melee infantry, and 4 missile infantry, well, then you've got a counter for everything. It sounds like that is a composition that theoretically can deal with any problem effectively, no matter what, right? But do you have the skills to use everything perfectly? In the example I just showed, I had 1 of each type of unit and only had to use 1 of each correctly. Now imagine you've got 2 types of 5 different units each, and you have to use them all correctly at the same opponent at the same time in a fight. Keeping your composition simpler and using 3 or 4 different units in total is a good way to make sure that your army is actually operating effectively. So I think we've talked enough about understanding the different types of units, as well as the considerations you want to take before you start putting units together. Now it's time to finally start building your army. To demonstrate how this works, I'll be using 2 baseline army composition styles to show what units synergize well and how they're supposed to be used together. So the first composition I've built is one where I put spearmen and archers in an army, and a little artillery if I can manage it. The reasons for this compositions are as follows. Archers, as discussed previously, are good against pretty much everything. In classic warfare terms, they're used to defeat enemy infantry, but in Total War Warhammer, they're of course great at hitting larger targets as well. However, we need to keep them safe, especially from enemy cavalry, right? Well, that's where the spearmen come into play. This gives you 1 unit, which is meant to deal damage and defeat your enemies, and another whose purpose is simply to keep those damage-dealing units safe. I also like to tack on a small number of artillery to this composition if I can, because it often forces the enemy to approach you. This allows you to set up a stronger defensive position of your own choosing. If I wanted to deploy further back or on a hill or something, I could do that, but it's still going to force the enemy to approach me because my artillery can hit them at a range which their units cannot. This way, the enemy is forced to enter into firing range of your artillery, and especially of your archers, in order to attempt to deal with the artillery that's dealing damage to them in the first place. Now, one key thing to note here is if you're finding yourself struggling with holding the line against the enemy, the answer is typically to bring more spearmen. While you won't be doing more damage that way, if you feel like you're getting overwhelmed when the enemy melee line hits you, or you're having trouble kind of focus firing down targets effectively enough for the archers to win the fights for you, then bringing more spearmen will help you kind of keep the battlefield manageable. It'll hold the enemy in place a little bit more easily and more often for you. Again, you'll probably end up taking a little bit more damage and won't end the fight quite as easily. But it'll still make it easier for you to manage it. If you're struggling with this composition, bring more spearmen is what I recommend. That's a good way to find a good balance and blend for yourself. Now, if you're looking to advance an army like this complexity a little bit, I'd suggest some of the specialty type of units that we talked about earlier. So you see I've brought up a high elf army here. This is where I'd probably add in some dragons or phoenix if I was playing the high elves. You know, this is going to be a high mobility unit. It can intervene in a lot of different fights and help give support where you're under attack, whether it's, you know, defensive support from the Frostheart Phoenix or offensive support from the Flamespire, Arcane Phoenix, Sun or Moon Dragon, or Star Dragon using their fire breath. And that way it only gives you a couple of smaller specific units to focus on, right? You're moving your Lord, you're moving the dragons, but for the rest of the army, just having the Spearmen and Archers in a proper formation is usually good enough to leave them alone and let them fire at will. So if you want to expand and advance this kind of formation, I think adding some specialty units is the way to go. The other composition type to talk about is a more aggressive and fast-paced one. This is the Swordsman and Cavalry combination type. The reason for this pairing is as follows. We just talked about how archers beat most things, and then spearmen are there to protect them, right? So if you want to use cavalry, just bringing cavalry isn't quite enough to defeat their archers and their spearmen. You need a tool to create vulnerabilities in their spearmen defensive lines. Enter swordsmen. In many cases, these types of units will deal good damage and break through the enemy front lines before the enemy can adjust or reposition. Now I've got a bit of a demonstration set up with this combination of units here. We can see they've got some ranged heavy units, some artillery, and a bunch of defensive spearmen. It's important in this situation to enter combat with the swordsmen first and then send the cavalry around to flank. Since your cavalry have higher mobility, it means they can enter into the battle later on, but still reach their target in a timely manner. And you don't want them to kind of get overextended and reach the enemy too early, or else they'll end up not having as good a value. And they'll just get target fired down and focused down, and unfortunately will die a little bit sooner as a result. Now you can see we took quite a bit of damage on the approach. That's pretty typical when using this army, especially if going up against an artillery heavy army. But you can also see that we've got a lot of their infantry. We've got all of their infantry tied down with infantry of our own, despite taking some damage. And we've got our cavalry on their back lines, which have now basically totally collapsed. They don't have any back lines anymore. They're going to have a really hard time continuing to get any value out of any of these missile units that remain. So their missile units, their artillery units, pretty much done for. And that puts us in a really good position. Now, I believe that if you find yourself struggling with this composition type, I think the solution is to bring more swordsmen. I didn't bring a lot of cavalry in this composition, and I think there's room for more, especially if you know what you're doing, you feel comfortable with micromanaging them, you can keep on top of all the battlefield tasks. But if you're having a hard time, like if you end up putting your cavalry into a fight for too long, or they get put in a bad matchup and you don't notice in time, if you want to ease the burden on yourself, bring more swordsman type units. They will be slower and ultimately will probably take more damage on approach, but it's easier to avoid making mistakes with that type of unit as well. Now, if you're looking to advance this army's complexity a little bit, I'd actually recommend adding a few archers or a few spearmen. Now, this might sound kind of strange, right? These are generally what I've classified as, more defensive composition type units, but we're putting them in an offensive type army. Well, if we look at a faction like the Vampire Coast, we can see some examples of why you'd want to bring it. They have some specialty units that are flying ranged units, right? I can't attack that with my Reichsguard. I can't attack that with my cavalry. I can't attack that with my swordsmen. So I may want to bring a few archers just for those kind of situations where the enemy is going to have targets that are going to be effective at staying out of reach of your melee troops, or even as support against large targets where they can do some more damage. And it's for the same reason that I recommend bringing spearmen type units, especially spearmen type units that are more oriented towards the anti-large purpose and a little bit less towards the line holding purpose. Again, we can use the Vampire Coast as the same example because they have some specialty units that are going to be large armor piercing targets. Now, as the Empire, I technically would have a unit available to me that's cavalry that has anti-large attached to it, so I could find a way to deal with this. But in general, with your cavalry and infantry composition types, you have an anti-archer tool, you have an anti-infantry tool, but you don't really have a good tool in this composition otherwise that is going to be anti-specialty unit, right? So again, that's where either the archers or the anti-large spearmen type unit is going to be good, right? These rotting Prometheans, this specialty unit isn't specifically built to trade really effectively against these unit types, though it will do pretty well. But the same is true for your units, right? These units aren't built to trade well against this unit. So just bringing a couple of backup units, like some specialty spearmen of your own or some archers that you can kind of hold in reserve and use to deal with the enemy's specialty units of their own, is going to be a good solution for advancing the complexity of this army. So this gives you two fundamental composition types to work with for any race to use in any matchup. I've broken down the various unit types into more basic classes in order to make them easier to understand, and I've talked about how they work and why they pair well with other units, as well as what purpose you would bring each type into battle for. Knowing your own race's strengths and weaknesses is a very important part of building a strong army. With the two composition types I've given here, you will have at least one which will prove effective for you no matter which race you're playing as. Knowing your enemy's weaknesses is important too, but you may not always have the option to take advantage of that weakness with the roster you have available to you. However, by first developing good fundamentals, you'll soon learn what some of the more unique situations you might encounter can be, and you'll be able to use these basic sets of rules to expand your skill set to deal with those special situations appropriately. I know I didn't talk too much about Lord or heroes in this guide, but I think that can be a complicated topic as well. There's a variety of different hero types that all can serve different purposes, and even with a single hero type, there can often be multiple purposes that hero has available to them. They're an important part of Total War Warhammer, but they aren't going to comprise of your entire army in most cases, so I think it's important to understand the fundamentals of your regular units first before diving too deep into more specific subjects. If you're ever uncertain, a good rule of thumb is just bring one of each hero type, or don't bring the one hero that matches your Lord type and bring all the rest. Hopefully with everything I've presented here in this guide, you are already well on your way to figuring out your own basic army compositions, finding the right units to put together, finding the units that work well for your race, and finding a balance of different unit types to put into your composition so that you can personally use them to their greatest effectiveness. If you did enjoy the video, please like and subscribe so that I know you liked it and so you don't miss out on any future content from me. If you have any army building tips of your own that you would recommend or you think I missed, please leave them in the comments section below. If you have any further questions about things I've talked about here, I'm happy to answer those as well. With that being said, thanks for watching, have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one.